Alfred Tyler shivered as consciousness crept back, the damp newspaper covering his body, offering little protection against the winter morning. His joints ached from sleeping on the hard concrete, and the previous night's rain had seeped through his layers of cardboard bedding. Opening his eyes to the gray dawn, he watched his breath form small clouds in the frigid air. With stiff fingers, he reached for his worn backpack, checking its contents as he did every morning. A few pieces of clothing, some wrapped in plastic bags to keep dry, a tattered wallet containing his last remaining photo of better days, a small notebook where he still jotted down thoughts, clinging to this final vestige of his former life. Everything was there, though most items were damp from the rainfall. The street was empty as Alfred pulled himself up, his 50-year-old body protesting every movement. The neighborhood was starting to wake up, and he needed to move before the early morning commuters began their day. He had learned long ago that people preferred not to see him, to pretend he didn't exist. It was easier that way, for them and sometimes for him too. The local market would open soon. Johnson's Grocery, his daily anchor point, where he could usually count on finding some discarded produce or day-old bread. The owner's employees sometimes left edible items in boxes near the back door, though they pretended not to notice him taking them. It was a dance of mutual acknowledgement and denial that had worked for months. As he approached the market, the first customers were already arriving. Alfred took his usual position, far enough from the entrance to avoid complaints, but close enough to spot any opportunities for food. The morning sun was struggling to break through the clouds, offering little warmth against the biting cold. That's when he saw her, an elderly woman struggling with several heavy shopping bags. Mary Johnson, though he didn't know her name yet, was attempting to manage far too many bags for her frail frame. Alfred watched as she nearly lost her balance, the weight of the groceries threatening to topple her. Something stirred inside him, a memory perhaps, of helping his own mother with shopping bags years ago. His instinct to remain invisible warred with an impulse he hadn't felt in years. Before he could stop himself, his feet were moving. "Excuse me, ma'am." His voice was rough from disuse. "Would you like some help with those?" The woman looked up, startled at first, then relief washed over her face. "Oh, that would be wonderful, thank you." She smiled, and for a moment, Alfred remembered what it felt like to be seen as a person rather than a shadow. He gathered most of the bags, careful to keep a respectful distance as they walked to her car. The weight was significant, but he welcomed the familiar strain of useful work in his muscles. "This weather is dreadful, isn't it?" she chatted as they walked. "Thank you for your kindness. Not many people would stop to help these days." "It's no trouble," Alfred replied softly, arranging the bags in her trunk. She reached into her purse. "Please, let me give you something for your help." Alfred stepped back, shaking his head. "No need, ma'am. I'm glad to help." He turned away before she could insist, retreating to his usual spot, feeling both warmed and uncomfortable by the interaction. As he settled back into his corner, Alfred reached for his backpack to check his belongings again, a habit born of necessity. His hand brushed against something unfamiliar, a wallet that wasn't his. His heart nearly stopped as he realized it must have fallen from one of the shopping bags. Opening the found wallet, Alfred's hands began to shake. Inside was not only an amount of money that could change his life, but something even more valuable. A family photo that triggered painful memories of his own past. His fingers traced the edges of the family photo, a holiday portrait showing the elderly woman with what appeared to be her son and his family. They were smiling, gathered around a Christmas tree, their happiness radiating from the glossy surface. The similarity to his own lost family photos was almost too much to bear. The money was substantial, several $100s in crisp bills. Alfred could feel the weight of possibility in his hands. A warm hotel room for a few nights, real meals, maybe even some new clothes. The thought made his stomach clench with both desire and shame. Through the market's windows, he could see the bustle of morning shoppers increasing. The elderly woman's car was gone, but she would surely notice the missing wallet soon. The right thing to do was clear, yet the temptation pulled at him like a physical force. A shadow fell across him, and Alfred quickly tucked the wallet into his jacket. Mike, another regular from the streets, had spotted him. Mike was younger, harder, his face bearing the scars of too many fights and too many hard winters. "What you got there, old man?" Mike's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Saw you talking to that rich lady. She give you something good." Alfred hunched his shoulders, trying to make himself smaller. "Just help with some bags. Nothing more." "Don't lie to me." Mike moved closer, his breath visible in the cold air. "I saw you looking at something. Share with a friend, yeah?" Other homeless people were gathering now, drawn by the prospect of something valuable. Alfred felt the walls closing in, his heart pounding against his ribs. These were people he saw every day, shared occasional food with, warned about police patrols. But desperation changed everything on the streets. "There's nothing to share," Alfred said firmly, clutching his backpack closer. The wallet felt like it was burning through his jacket. Mike's hand shot out, grabbing Alfred's collar. "Don't be selfish, old-timer. We all gotta survive out here." Alfred twisted away, but not before Mike's other hand found the wallet's outline. The younger man's eyes lit up with predatory interest. What followed was a blur of motion. Mike lunging for the wallet, Alfred protecting it with his body, other hands grabbing at his clothes and bag. In the scuffle, Alfred took several hard hits, but something had awakened in him. A fierce determination he thought had died years ago. With strength he didn't know he still possessed, he broke free from the group, snatching up his backpack and running. His feet carried him around the corner of the market, his lungs burning in the cold air. Behind him, he could hear Mike shouting threats, but the voice grew distant as Alfred pushed himself harder. He had to find the elderly woman. The market's owner might know her. She seemed familiar with the place. It was his only chance to make things right. As he caught his breath in an alley, Alfred pulled out the wallet again. Blood from a split lip dripped onto its leather surface, and he wiped it away carefully. Inside, behind the photo and money, he found a driver's license. The name made his heart skip, Mary Johnson. She wasn't just a regular customer. She was the owner's mother. Looking around the corner at the market's entrance, Alfred saw her returning, likely having discovered her loss. Her son was with her now, his face concerned as they talked. Alfred touched his bruised face, straightened his tattered jacket, and took a deep breath. This was the moment to choose: remain invisible or do what he knew was right. Alfred watched the young man from behind the market's glass door, huddled against the cold just as he had been months ago. The boy couldn't be more than 20, his thin jacket offering little protection against the bitter winter wind. Without hesitation, Alfred grabbed a sandwich and a cup of hot coffee from the deli counter. "Here," he said, stepping outside. The young man flinched, clearly expecting to be chased away. "It's okay. I've been where you are." The boy's hands trembled as he accepted the food. "Thanks," he mumbled, taking a careful sip of the coffee. I can't pay." "No need," Alfred smiled, settling on the bench beside him. "What's your name?" "Michael." "I'm Alfred. And this," he gestured to the market behind them, "could be your fresh start if you want it." Mary appeared at the door, her kind eyes taking in the scene. She nodded approvingly before heading back inside. Over the past months, she had become the heart of their little community outreach program, always ready with a warm word and practical advice. "We're starting a new initiative," Alfred explained. "Job training, basic accommodation, and a chance to rebuild." He paused, remembering his own journey. No strings attached, just an opportunity. Jacob emerged from his office, carrying some papers. The market owner had undergone his own transformation, from suspicious businessman to community leader. The employment program had been his idea, born from watching Alfred's successful rehabilitation. "Got another one for our program?" Jacob asked, joining them outside. Michael tensed, but Alfred's reassuring presence kept him from bolting. Michael here might be interested in learning the ropes. The market had changed significantly since Alfred's first day as an employee. The back storage area had been converted into a small dormitory with basic facilities. Local businesses had joined their initiative, offering various entry-level positions to people trying to get back on their feet. As they showed Michael around, Alfred was hit by a sudden memory of the accident that had derailed his life. His wife's laugh cut short, his daughter's favorite doll lying broken on the asphalt. But for the first time, the memory didn't bring him to his knees. He had finally found peace with his past, understanding that while he couldn't change it, he could use his experience to help others. This is where you can stay. Alfred showed Michael the clean, simple room. We start with basics, stocking shelves, helping customers. Show up, work hard, and opportunities will follow. Mary appeared with fresh linens and toiletries. Everyone deserves a second chance, she said, her eyes meeting Alfred's. They both knew she had recognized him from the old newspaper articles long before he'd revealed his identity. The Community Support Center was bustling with activity. What had started as a simple idea had grown into a network of hope. Other shop owners regularly stopped by, offering jobs or donations. The local shelter coordinated with them, referring people who showed promise and determination. Alfred spent the afternoon training Michael on the register, remembering his own first day. How strange it had felt to be trusted with responsibility again. The young man was quick to learn, his eyes bright with renewed purpose. "You know," Jacob said later, as they watched Michael carefully arranging produce displays, "when Mom first offended you, I thought she was crazy. Now look at all this." Alfred nodded, understanding perfectly. Sometimes people just need someone to believe in them. That evening, they held a small welcome dinner for Michael in the break room, a tradition they'd started for new program participants. Mary brought her famous lasagna, and several program graduates who now worked in nearby businesses stopped by to offer encouragement. As Alfred watched Michael tentatively joining the conversation, he felt a profound sense of completion. His own tragedy had led him here, to this moment, where he could extend the same lifeline that Mary and Jacob had offered him. Later, closing up the market, Alfred caught his reflection in the window. The man staring back at him wasn't the broken executive who'd lost everything, nor the homeless man who'd helped an elderly lady with her groceries. He was someone new, someone whole. Michael was arranging his few belongings in his new room when Alfred checked on him one last time. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow's a new day." As Alfred watched the young man beginning his own journey to recovery, he smiled, knowing that sometimes the greatest value isn't in what we possess, but in the gestures we share. "Thanks," Michael said softly, his eyes revealing a mix of fear and hope. "I won't let you down." The words echoed in Alfred's mind as he climbed the stairs to his own apartment above the market. He remembered saying something similar to Mary months ago. His small living space had become home, decorated with a few photographs, some old, some new. The latest addition was a group photo from their first community dinner, everyone smiling, belonging. He sat at his small desk, opening the ledger where he tracked the program's progress. 23 people helped so far, 17 still employed, 12 in stable housing. Numbers that represented changed lives, broken cycles. He added Michael's name to the list, feeling the weight of that responsibility. His phone buzzed, a message from Jacob about tomorrow's supply delivery. The business was thriving, their reputation for community involvement actually bringing in more customers. Other markets in the area had initially scoffed at their program, but now some were asking for advice on starting similar initiatives. Alfred opened his window, letting in the cool night air. From here, he could see the spot where he used to sleep, now empty. The streetlight illuminated the bench where he'd first helped Mary with her groceries. One simple gesture that had changed everything. He thought about his wife and daughter, allowing their memory to wash over him. "I think you'd be proud," he whispered to the night sky. "I finally found my way back." Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to help others find their way back too. But for now, Alfred watched the quiet street below, at peace with his place in the world, knowing that sometimes the darkest paths lead to the brightest destinations. When he finally turned in for the night, he could hear faint movement from Michael's room below, someone else beginning their journey home. The cycle was complete, but in many ways, it was just beginning. Alfred's hands trembled as he stared at the family photograph inside the wallet. The smiling faces of Mary Johnson and what appeared to be her children gazed back at him, stirring memories he'd fought hard to suppress. The crisp bills tucked behind the photo seemed to mock him. Enough money to change his immediate circumstances, to afford a warm bed and decent meals for weeks. What ya got there, Al? The gravelly voice of Mike, a fellow homeless man, broke through his thoughts. Alfred quickly closed the wallet, but not before Mike caught a glimpse of its contents. The older man's weathered face transformed, his eyes gleaming with sudden interest. "Let me see that," Mike demanded, reaching for the wallet. Several other street regulars began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Alfred clutched the wallet tighter. "It belongs to someone. I need to return it." Mike laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the alley. "Return it? Are you crazy? That's your ticket to a better life, man. At least for a while." The others murmured in agreement, closing in around Alfred. For a moment, Alfred's mind drifted to another time, another life. His daughter's laughter as she opened birthday presents, his wife's warm smile across the dinner table. The photograph in the wallet had triggered these memories with brutal clarity. "The money ain't yours to give back," Mike pressed, taking a step closer. "Finders keepers, Al. That's the rule of the streets." "No." Alfred's voice was firm. "There's a family here, Mike. This matters to them." Mike's face hardened. "You've gone soft." Without warning, he lunged forward, grabbing for the wallet. Alfred twisted away, but Mike's momentum carried them both into the brick wall. Pain shot through Alfred's shoulder as he struggled to maintain his grip on the wallet. Two other men joined the fray, trying to pry the wallet from Alfred's hands. Fighting against the instinct to simply give in, Alfred kicked out, catching Mike in the shin. The older man cursed and stumbled back. Seizing his chance, Alfred snatched up his worn backpack and ran. His feet pounded against the cold pavement as he fled, ignoring the shouts behind him. He didn't stop until he reached the parking lot of Johnson's Market, his chest heaving with exertion. The morning crowd was starting to arrive. Alfred scanned the lot for Mary's car, relief washing over him when he spotted it in the same space as earlier. As he approached the store entrance, he noticed a man watching him through the window. Jacob Johnson, the owner, whose stern expression made Alfred hesitate. Mary emerged from the store, her face lighting up with recognition. "Oh, it's you again, the kind gentleman from this morning." Before Alfred could respond, Jacob stepped outside, positioning himself between Alfred and his mother. "Is there a problem here?" No problem," Alfred said quickly, reaching for the wallet. "Mrs. Johnson, I believe this belongs to you. It must have gotten mixed up with my things when I helped with your bags." Mary's eyes widened. "My wallet. I've been looking everywhere for it." As she reached for it, Jacob's hand shot out, grabbing Alfred's wrist. "How convenient that you found it," he said, his voice hard with suspicion. "After helping with the bags, were you? More like helping yourself to what's inside." "Jacob," Mary protested, but her son wasn't listening. "Thief! Police!" Jacob shouted, maintaining his grip on Alfred's wrist as curious customers began to gather around them, that a small crowd began to form around them, their whispers and stares piercing Alfred like needles. He could have broken free from Jacob's grip. His years on the street had taught him how. But he remained still, knowing any sudden movement would only confirm their worst suspicions. "I didn't steal anything," Alfred said quietly, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Everything's still in there. Count it if you want." Mary reached for the wallet, her fingers brushing against Alfred's as she took it. She opened it carefully, checking its contents while Jacob maintained his accusatory glare. "Everything's here," she confirmed, relief evident in her voice. "Every dollar, all my cards, even the pictures." "That doesn't prove anything," Jacob insisted. He could have been interrupted before taking anything. Alfred felt the weight of his own worn wallet in his back pocket, containing the last photo he had of his family. The parallel wasn't lost on him. How something so simple could mean everything. "The money means nothing to me," he said, looking directly at Mary. "But that family photo in there, I couldn't keep that from someone. I know what it's like to lose things that can't be replaced." Mike appeared at the edge of the gathering, his presence adding another layer of tension to the scene. Alfred could see the conflict in his former friend's face, the desire to get even warring with some remnant of conscience. "He's telling the truth," Mike called out unexpectedly. "I saw him find it, tried to convince him to keep it, but he wouldn't listen." The admission seemed to cost him something, his shoulders sagging as he spoke. The grip on Alfred's wrist loosened slightly, but Jacob's suspicion remained palpable. "Why should we believe either of you?" "Because," Mary interjected, her voice carrying a quiet authority, "not everyone in this world is what they seem at first glance." She was looking at Alfred with an expression he couldn't quite read, as if she was seeing beyond his ragged appearance to something else entirely. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. Several customers who had been watching the scene unfold began to disperse, not wanting to get involved. Alfred felt his heart sink. He knew how this would look to the police, knew the assumptions they would make. "Jacob," Mary said firmly, placing her hand on her son's arm, "let him go. I won't press charges against someone who did the right thing." Jacob hesitated, his internal struggle visible on his face. The sirens were getting closer. Finally, he released Alfred's wrist, stepping back but maintaining his protective stance near his mother. Mike had already melted away into the background, leaving Alfred alone to face whatever came next. He straightened his shoulders, ready to accept whatever consequences awaited him, knowing that despite everything, he had made the right choice. "Thief! Police!" Jacob's shout still echoed in the air, while Mary tried to intervene, and Alfred stood frozen, watching his good deed transform into a nightmare. The police cruiser's lights flashed against the market's windows as two officers hurried through the entrance. Alfred stood frozen, his weathered hand still gripping the returned wallet, while Jacob Johnson's accusatory finger pointed directly at him. The morning crowd had grown, forming a semicircle of whispers and suspicious glances. "This man is a thief," Jacob declared, his voice carrying across the store. "He's been hanging around here for weeks, and suddenly items start disappearing." Officer Matthews, a stern-faced policeman in his 40s, stepped forward. "Sir, please put the wallet down and keep your hands where we can see them." Alfred carefully placed the wallet on the counter, his movements slow and deliberate. "I was just returning it," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I found it mixed with my things after helping Mrs. Johnson with her bags this morning." Mary Johnson pushed through the gathering crowd, her small frame commanding attention despite her age. "Officers, there's been a misunderstanding. This man helped me earlier today. He's telling the truth." The second officer, Rodriguez, began searching Alfred's worn backpack. The contents of his life spilled onto the counter. A few pieces of clothing, some newspaper clippings, and an old leather wallet held together with rubber bands. As Rodriguez opened Alfred's wallet, a stack of aged photographs fell out. Mary's eyes caught something in one of the images, and her expression changed subtly. She moved closer, studying the photographs while Jacob continued his tirade. "It's not just a wallet," Jacob insisted, running his hand through his hair in frustration. "We've had customers complaining about missing items for weeks now. Phone, keys, a watch last Tuesday." The growing crowd of customers added their voices to the chaos. "My sunglasses disappeared last week," called out a woman in a red coat. "They were expensive ones, too." Alfred's mind flashed back to his corporate office 15 years ago, when he was the one making accusations during inventory disputes. The irony wasn't lost on him, but the memory brought no comfort. Through the commotion, a disheveled figure appeared at the store's entrance. Mike, still sporting a bruise from their earlier confrontation, stepped forward. "Hey!" he called out, drawing everyone's attention. "Alfred's telling the truth. I saw him find that wallet this morning. He wouldn't even let me look at it, said it had to be returned." Jacob scoffed. "Oh, great, another homeless person vouching for him. That's real reliable." "Jacob," Mary's sharp tone cut through the tension. "That's enough." She turned to Officer Matthews. "I'm not pressing any charges. In fact, I'm grateful to this man for returning my wallet intact." The officer looked between mother and son, then back to Alfred. "Ma'am, are you sure? Given the other reported thefts." "I'm quite sure," Mary stated firmly. "And I'd stake my reputation on this man's honesty." Officer Matthews sighed, returning the backpack's contents to Alfred. "All right, you're free to go. But," he added, fixing Alfred with a stern look, "I suggest you keep your distance from this store for a while. Avoid any misunderstandings." Alfred nodded, gathering his belongings with trembling hands. As he turned to leave, he caught Mary's gaze. There was something in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps? She held one of his old photographs carefully, as if it contained some secret. The crowd parted reluctantly as Alfred made his way to the exit. Behind him, he could hear Jacob and Mary arguing in hushed tones, their words lost in the morning bustle of the store. As Alfred disappeared into the street, Mary whispered to herself, recognizing a name in the old photograph. She knew exactly who he really was. Outside, the morning sun had risen fully, casting harsh shadows across the parking lot. Alfred's legs felt weak as he rounded the corner of the building, his heart still racing from the confrontation. He could hear Mike's footsteps behind him. "Hey, man, you okay?" Mike called out, catching up. That was intense back there. Alfred leaned against a brick wall, letting his backpack slide to the ground. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him exhausted. "I did the right thing," he muttered, more to himself than to Mike. "Yeah, you did. Fat lot of good it did you, though." Mike kicked at some loose gravel. "That owner's a real piece of work." Inside the store, Mary Johnson was still holding Alfred's old photograph, studying it with increasing certainty. The image showed a younger Alfred in a business suit, accepting an award at what appeared to be a corporate gala. The caption read, "Alfred Tyler, CEO of Tyler & Associates, Business Leader of the Year." "Mom, what are you looking at?" Jacob asked, his anger from earlier still evident in his voice. "Something that changes everything," Mary replied, carefully tucking the photo into her purse. She needed time to verify her suspicions before saying more. The morning continued, with customers discussing the incident in hushed tones as they shopped. Two young employees, Tom and Steve, exchanged knowing glances as they restocked shelves, their movements more hurried than usual. Officer Matthews lingered in his patrol car, filling out his report. He watched as Alfred and Mike slowly walked away from the store, heading toward the small park where many of the area's homeless gathered during the day. "You know," Mike said as they walked, "you could have bought food for a month with what was in that wallet." Alfred stopped, turning to face his companion. "And I wouldn't have been able to sleep for a year. Some things are worth more than money, Mike." Back in the store, Mary approached Jacob at the register. "That man isn't who you think he is," she said quietly. "And I believe we've made a terrible mistake in how we handled this." Jacob looked up from the register, surprised by the emotion in his mother's voice. "What do you mean?" "I need to make some calls first," Mary replied, her hand touching her purse where the photograph lay hidden. "But trust me, son, there's much more to this story than we know." The morning sun climbed higher, casting its light on both the comfortable and the destitute, while Mary Johnson began her quest to uncover the truth about the man who had chosen honesty over necessity, dignity over desperation. In her small office behind the store, Mary pulled out her old address book, flipping through pages until she found the number she was looking for. As she dialed, her eyes fell on the photograph again, and her suspicions grew stronger with each passing moment. The man who had helped her with her groceries, who had returned her wallet despite his desperate circumstances, was indeed someone she had read about years ago, someone whose tragic story had touched her heart when it made headlines. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello, Margaret?" "Yes, it's Mary Johnson. I need to ask you about someone you might remember, Alfred Tyler." Mary Johnson sat at her desk at home, the glow of her computer screen illuminating her concerned face as she scrolled through old news articles. Her fingers trembled slightly as she typed Alfred Tyler into the search bar, her mind still processing the events of the past few days. Outside the market, Alfred kept his distance, watching from across the street. The morning crowd moved in and out of the store, carrying their groceries, living their normal lives. He had found a new spot, far enough to avoid trouble, but close enough to keep an eye on the place that had become central to his existence. The usual morning routine at Johnson's Market was disrupted when 2 men in dark hoodies entered the store. At first, they looked like regular customers, but Alfred's years on the street had taught him to read people. Something wasn't right about their purposeful stride and the way their eyes darted around. Inside, the cashiers continued their work, unaware of the impending danger. Mary was at the register, helping an elderly customer count change when the first man pulled out a gun. The second reached into his jacket, revealing another weapon. "Everyone down! This is a robbery," the taller one shouted, his voice muffled by a bandana. Customers dropped to the floor, some screaming, others frozen in terror. Mary's hands shook as she tried to open the register. The elderly customer beside her began to hyperventilate. From his position near the entrance, Alfred's mind raced. Years of corporate decision-making kicked in, analyzing angles, risks, and possibilities. He could walk away. No one would blame a homeless man for not getting involved. But Mary's kind face flashed in his mind, and he knew he couldn't leave. The second robber was distracted, trying to control a group of teenage customers who wouldn't stop whimpering. Alfred saw his chance. With the silence and precision that street life had taught him, he moved through the store's entrance. Years of sleeping with one eye open had honed his instincts. Alfred grabbed a metal display stand and, in one fluid motion, swung it at the first robber's legs. The man went down hard, his gun skittering across the floor. The second robber turned, but Alfred was already moving. He tackled the armed man, driving him into a display of canned goods. They crashed to the ground in a shower of metal cans and curse words. Customers scrambled away as the 2 men wrestled on the floor. Alfred took a hard punch to the jaw, but managed to keep his grip on the robber's gun hand. A shot rang out, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling. Other customers found their courage. A burly man who Alfred recognized as a regular grabbed the first robber before he could recover his weapon. 2 younger men joined the fray, helping Alfred subdue the second assailant. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Alfred's body ached from the fight, blood trickling from a cut above his eye where he'd caught an elbow. But he maintained his hold until he heard the distinctive sound of handcuffs clicking into place. The police arrived in force, securing the scene and taking statements. Alfred sat on a box of produce, holding a cloth to his bleeding forehead while paramedics checked his injuries. Jacob Johnson stood nearby, his expression a mix of disbelief and reassessment. Mary rushed over with a first aid kit, her hands gentle as she helped clean Alfred's wounds. Her eyes held a knowing look, one that suggested she'd been putting pieces together about his past. The store buzzed with excited chatter as customers recounted the event to arriving officers. Some pointed at Alfred, their voices filled with admiration rather than the usual suspicion. The transformation in their attitudes was palpable. As Mary dabbed antiseptic on his cut, she leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were an executive at Tyler and Associates, weren't you?" Alfred froze, the blood draining from his face. The words hung in the air between them as Alfred's pulse quickened. The familiar name of his old company struck him like a physical blow. Around them, the chaos of the aftermath continued. Police taking statements, customers sharing their versions of events, and workers beginning to clean up the mess of scattered groceries. Jacob approached them, his stance notably different from the hostile posture he'd maintained in previous days. He held a cup of water in one hand and some forms in the other. "The police need your statement," he said, offering the water to Alfred. "But first, drink something. You look pale." Alfred accepted the water with trembling hands, acutely aware of Mary's penetrating gaze. She hadn't moved away, and her question still demanded an answer. The weight of his past pressed down on him like a physical force. "How did you?" Alfred started, but was interrupted by a detective who needed his account of the incident. As Alfred described the robbery and his intervention, he could see Mary in his peripheral vision, moving to her son and whispering something in his ear. Jacob's eyes widened, and he looked at Alfred with newfound recognition. The detective finished his questions and moved on to other witnesses. The paramedics had cleared Alfred, determining he needed no further medical attention, despite the impressive bruise forming on his jaw and the cut above his eye. "You could have been killed," Jacob said, his voice carrying a note of respect that hadn't been there before. "Why did you do it?" Alfred looked at the floor, then at Mary, and finally met Jacob's eyes. "Because some things are worth protecting," he said quietly. "Your mother showed me kindness when others wouldn't. Sometimes that's all it takes to remind you who you used to be." The last customers were leaving the store, and the police were finishing their investigation. The two would-be robbers had been taken away in separate patrol cars, their failed heist adding another chapter to the store's history. Mary returned with a newspaper clipping she retrieved from her office. The yellowed paper showed a younger Alfred in a business suit, standing proudly in front of the Tyler and Associates building. The headline read, "Local firm expands, CEO projects record growth." Alfred stared at the image of his former self, memories flooding back. Board meetings, client dinners, the corner office with a view of the city. But most painfully, he remembered the family photos that had decorated that office, images of happiness that now existed only in his mind. "How long have you known?" he asked Mary, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary touched his arm gently. "I wasn't sure at first," she said, "but I remember reading about what happened to your family. No one should have to go through that alone." Jacob watched this exchange, his previous judgments crumbling as he began to understand the complexity of the man before him. The homeless person he'd been so quick to condemn had just risked his life to protect his store and his mother. The cleanup continued around them as the last rays of sunlight filtered through the store windows. The day's events had changed everything: perceptions, relationships, and possibilities. Alfred felt exposed, his carefully maintained anonymity stripped away by Mary's recognition. "You were an executive at Tyler and Associates, weren't you?" The question that had started this revelation still hung in the air, waiting for Alfred's official acknowledgement of a past he'd spent years trying to forget. "Yes, I was," Alfred whispered, his weathered hands trembling as he sat in Mary's small office at the back of the store. The familiar name of Tyler and Associates hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken memories. Mary's eyes softened with understanding as she pulled out an old newspaper clipping from her desk drawer. The yellowed paper showed a younger Alfred, clean-shaven in an expensive suit, standing proudly next to his wife Sarah and their daughter Emily. The headline read, "Local Executive's Family Tragedy." The memory crashed over Alfred like a tidal wave. The rain-slicked roads, the screeching tires, the sickening crunch of metal. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the arms of his chair, fighting against a flood of images. Sarah's last smile, Emily's favorite stuffed rabbit, lying in the wreckage. "I remember reading about it," Mary said gently. "It was about 8 years ago, wasn't it?" Alfred nodded, unable to speak. Through the office window, he could see Jacob watching them, his expression a mix of confusion and growing comprehension. The store's customers moved about their shopping, occasionally glancing toward the office, their earlier hostility replaced by curious whispers. After the funeral, Alfred finally managed, his voice rough with emotion. I couldn't go back to the house, couldn't walk past Emily's room or see Sarah's garden. The company offered leave, but He trailed off, looking down at his worn shoes. You disappeared, Mary finished softly. The door opened, and Jacob entered quietly, listening as Alfred continued his story. The descent had been swift. Hotels at first, then cheaper motels, finally the streets. The money hadn't mattered anymore. Nothing had. I never meant to stay homeless, Alfred explained, meeting Jacob's eyes. But after a while, it seemed easier to be invisible, to not have to explain or remember. Mary reached across the desk, her hand covering Alfred's. I lost my husband 20 years ago, she shared. Different circumstances, but grief is grief. It can swallow you whole if you let it. The confession hung in the air as Jacob pulled up a chair, his previous hostility melting away. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the store windows, highlighting the dusty shelves where Alfred had recently helped prevent a robbery. The other employees, Jacob said, breaking the silence, they've confessed to more thefts. They were targeting vulnerable customers, especially the elderly. He paused, looking at Alfred with newfound respect. We could use someone with your experience here, someone who understands both business and people. Alfred glanced at the newspaper clipping again, at the man he used to be. Mary squeezed his hand encouragingly. Sometimes, she said, life gives us second chances in unexpected places. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the storefront. Through the window, they could see several police officers entering, their faces serious. One of them approached the office, holding a manila envelope. Mr. Johnson, the officer called out, we have some new information about your former employees. They weren't just working alone. The sunlight caught the police badge as the officer stepped into the office, casting dancing reflections on the walls. Alfred straightened in his chair, feeling a strange mix of his old executive instincts and his street-learned wariness. The theft ring, the officer continued. It's bigger than we thought. Much bigger. The officer laid out several photographs on Mary's desk, showing surveillance footage from various stores across the city. Alfred leaned forward, his business acumen surfacing as he studied the patterns and the images. These men, the officer explained, pointing to familiar faces, were working with a larger organization targeting small businesses throughout the district. Your store wasn't their first hit, Mr. Johnson. Mary's hand flew to her mouth as she recognized other elderly customers from neighboring shops in the photos. Jacob's jaw tightened as he flipped through the evidence, his earlier prejudices against Alfred seeming increasingly foolish in light of these revelations. The stolen goods were being fenced through a warehouse downtown, the officer continued. We recovered quite a bit of merchandise, including items from your store. Alfred's mind raced, connecting dots from his days on the street. He'd seen suspicious activities around that warehouse, but had always kept his distance, following his policy of staying invisible. Now, that same street knowledge could prove valuable. I've seen their operations, Alfred said quietly. From the outside, they're careful, organized. This isn't just petty theft. Jacob looked at him with growing interest. Would you be willing to help us improve our security? We clearly need it, and your unique perspective could be invaluable. Alfred glanced at his reflection in the office window, his ragged clothes, his unkempt beard. But beneath the shabby exterior, he could still see traces of the executive he'd once been. The skills hadn't disappeared. They'd just been buried under years of grief and survival. Mary stood up, her decision made. We have a small apartment above the store. It's been empty since Jacob moved out. It needs some work, but... Mom... Jacob started to protest, then stopped, looking at Alfred thoughtfully. Actually, that's not a bad idea. We need someone to keep an eye on the place at night anyway. Alfred felt overwhelmed by their kindness, memories of his old life colliding with the harsh reality of recent years. He thought of Sarah, how she'd always believed in helping others, how Emily had inherited her mother's compassionate heart. The afternoon light was fading now, casting long shadows across the office floor. Through the window, customers continued their shopping, unaware of the life-changing conversation taking place just feet away. A young mother passed by with her daughter, the little girl clutching a stuffed rabbit similar to Emily's. Alfred's heart clenched, but for the first time in years, the pain was accompanied by something else: hope. The officer gathered his photographs, leaving one final piece of information that would change everything. An officer just arrived at the station with new details about the arrested employees. They're connected to something much larger than we initially suspected. Detective Morgan placed a thick folder on Jacob's office desk, spreading out surveillance photos across the wooden surface. Alfred leaned forward, his experienced eyes scanning the images of familiar faces around different stores in the neighborhood. These guys were part of something much bigger, Morgan explained, pointing at the former employees' mugshots. We've linked them to at least 12 other establishments in the area. Alfred's fingers traced patterns between the locations on a map, his old executive instincts kicking in. There's a system here, he muttered, drawing invisible lines. They're targeting family-owned businesses, places with minimal security. Mary stood behind him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Jacob, who watched from across the room, his arms crossed but his expression softer than it had been in weeks. Mr. Tyler, Jacob cleared his throat, we could use someone with your analytical skills. If you're interested in a position here. Alfred's hand trembled slightly as he looked up. It had been years since anyone had offered him legitimate work. I'd be honored. The first day was harder than he'd anticipated. Customers did double takes, some clutching their bags closer when they recognized him as the homeless man who used to linger outside. But Mary's presence helped, her warm introduction slowly breaking down barriers. Alfred's helping us improve our security, she'd tell them, and gradually, suspicious glances turned to cautious smiles. During inventory, Alfred discovered more evidence of the former employee's scheme, subtle discrepancies in the books that his business background helped him identify. Each finding strengthened Jacob's growing trust in him. They were skimming more than just products, Alfred explained one evening, showing Jacob the patterns in the financial records. See these small variances? They add up to thousands over time. The next morning, while organizing storage boxes, Alfred heard commotion at the front. Two of the former employees had shown up, their faces twisted with anger. You think you're better than us now? One sneered, advancing toward Alfred. Before they could get closer, Jacob appeared beside him. Get out of my store, Jacob's voice was steel, or I'm calling Detective Morgan. After they left, Alfred stood straighter in his new uniform, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. His first paycheck felt surreal, a small amount by his old standards, but it represented something far more valuable: dignity. Using his corporate experience, Alfred implemented new security protocols. He installed cameras in strategic locations, trained staff on loss prevention, and established inventory controls that would have caught the previous theft ring much earlier. You're making quite a difference here, Mary said one afternoon, watching him organize the stockroom with military precision. This place hasn't run this smoothly in years. Alfred allowed himself a small smile as he straightened his name tag. The simple plastic badge meant more to him than any executive title he'd held before. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to prove himself. Working with the other employees, he shared what he'd learned both in the corporate world and on the streets. His unique perspective helped bridge gaps between management and staff, creating a more unified team. The store began to transform. Sales improved as word spread about the improved service and security. Regular customers who had once avoided his gaze now sought his advice on products. Even Jacob's initial reluctance had evolved into genuine respect. One evening, as Alfred was closing up, he found himself staring at his reflection in the store window. The man looking back at him stood straighter, looked cleaner, seemed more alive than he had in years. His new apartment above the store, though tiny, felt like a palace after years on the street. He was just finishing the day's paperwork when an envelope slid under the office door. Opening it, his blood ran cold as he read the anonymous message threatening not just him, but everyone who had helped him rebuild his life. The letter trembled in his hands, its crude words promising retribution against the traitor who sided with management. Alfred recognized the handwriting. It matched notes he'd found in the stockroom during his security audit. He thought of Mary's kindness, of Jacob's growing trust, of the small community that had gradually accepted him. The threat wasn't just against him. It targeted everything he'd fought to rebuild. Scanning the letter again, Alfred noticed small details that spoke volumes. References to storage procedures that only former employees would know, mentions of specific dates that aligned with past thefts. His executive training kicked in, analyzing patterns and implications. "We should contact Detective Morgan," Jacob said when Alfred showed him the letter the next morning. His face had hardened, protective instinct flaring for his store and his mother. Mary studied the letter through her reading glasses, her usual warmth replaced by determination. "We need those security cameras installed today," she declared. "I'll make the calls." Throughout the day, Alfred caught glimpses of unfamiliar faces, watching the store from across the street. He recognized the predatory stance of street surveillance. He'd seen it often enough during his homeless years. The threat was real and immediate. As closing time approached, Alfred gathered the staff for an emergency meeting. Drawing from both his corporate crisis management experience and street survival instincts, he outlined new safety protocols. "No one leaves alone," he instructed. "We use the buddy system, vary our routes home, report anything suspicious." That evening, while reviewing security footage, Alfred discovered something that made his stomach turn. Hidden behind timestamp glitches and camera angles, he found evidence of an even larger operation. The store had been merely one piece in an elaborate network of retail crime. "Look at this," he showed Jacob, pointing to patterns in customer behavior. "These aren't random shoplifters. This is organized, professional." Jacob leaned closer to the screen, his jaw clenched. "How deep does this go?" Before Alfred could answer, a stone crashed through the office window, sending glass shards flying. Attached to it was another note, more threatening than the first. "You can wear that uniform and play manager all you want," it read, "but we know what you really are, and soon everyone else will too." Alfred picked up the stone, feeling its weight in his hand. In his years on the street, he'd learned that threats often preceded action. The store had become more than just his workplace. It was his home, his redemption, his family. He wouldn't let anyone destroy that. An anonymous letter arrived at the store early the next morning, specifically targeting Alfred. The message was clear. His past would never let him go. Alfred stared at the anonymous letter in his trembling hands, the paper crinkling under his tight grip. The words, crudely cut from magazines and newspapers, spelled out a clear message: leave the market or face the consequences. He'd faced threats before during his years on the streets, but this was different. Now he had something to lose. Jacob burst through the storage room door, his face flushed with anger. "We need to call the police right now," he demanded, reaching for the letter. "This is serious, Alfred. These people aren't playing games." Mary's calm voice cut through the tension as she entered. "Before we do anything rash, we should think this through." She moved to the security monitor display they'd recently installed. "We have cameras now. Perhaps we should review the footage first, see who delivered it." Alfred nodded, already pulling up the morning's recordings. His executive past had prepared him well for organizing security protocols, and he'd implemented several measures since starting work at the market. The footage showed a hooded figure slipping the envelope under the door before dawn. Wait, Alfred said, freezing the frame. That walk. I know that walk. The peculiar limp was unmistakable. It belonged to Marcus, one of the recently released ex-employees. They were interrupted by Sarah, a young cashier, rushing in with another envelope. This one contained photographs. Alfred walking to work, Mary at her home, Jacob with his family. The message was clear. They were being watched. That night, while closing up, Alfred heard glass breaking at the back of the store. He moved silently through the aisles, his years on the street having taught him how to move without being noticed. Two figures were attempting to force the back door. In the dim light, he recognized both Marcus and his former partner in crime, Steve. Alfred reached for his phone, already dialing Jacob's number. Before he could press call, Marcus spotted him. Well, looks like the hero is working late. The mockery in his voice carried years of resentment. You don't want to do this, Alfred said firmly, standing his ground. The police already know about your previous activities. Steve lunged forward, but Alfred was ready. Years of defending himself on the streets hadn't been forgotten. He sidestepped the attack, using Steve's momentum to send him sprawling into a display of canned goods. The crash echoed through the empty store. Seconds later, police sirens wailed in the distance. Jacob burst through the front door, having received a silent alarm notification. Marcus and Steve fled, leaving behind a duffel bag full of tools and a notebook that would later reveal connections to a larger criminal organization operating in the area. The following days brought more letters, each more threatening than the last. Mary worried constantly, but Alfred refused to back down. I've lost everything once before, he told her one morning. I won't let fear take away what I've rebuilt. The market's other employees rallied around Alfred. They created buddy systems for closing shifts, installed additional security lights, and kept watch for suspicious activities. Regular customers, having heard about the threats, began reporting any unusual behavior they noticed around the store. During a staff meeting, Alfred addressed the team. I know this situation has everyone on edge, he said, looking at each face around the table. But we're stronger together. This market isn't just a store, it's a community, and we protect our own. Jacob, who had initially hired Alfred with reservations, now stood firmly behind him. We're not going to let these thugs win, he declared, placing a supportive hand on Alfred's shoulder. This market has been here for 30 years, and no criminals are going to change that. They developed a comprehensive security plan, installing more cameras and implementing new safety protocols. Alfred's business experience proved invaluable as he organized schedules and procedures to ensure nobody ever worked alone. The local police increased their patrols, and slowly, the threatening letters became less frequent. But Alfred remained vigilant, especially when it came to Mary's safety. She had become like family to him, and he wouldn't let anything happen to her. One evening, as Alfred was reviewing security footage, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A suspicious figure was lurking near Mary's apartment, and Alfred faced a crucial decision that would test everything he stood for. A suspicious figure was seen near Mary's apartment, and Alfred needed to make a crucial decision. The figure moved with practiced stealth, keeping to the shadows of Mary's building. Through the grainy security footage, Alfred could make out the same distinctive posture he'd seen in previous recordings. His jaw clenched as he reached for his phone to call Jacob. I've got movement at your mother's place, he said quietly into the receiver. Same guy from last week. I'm 10 minutes out, Jacob responded, voice tense. Don't do anything stupid, Alfred. But Alfred was already grabbing his jacket. The streets had taught him timing was everything, and right now, Mary was alone in her apartment. The walk that normally took 7 minutes he covered in 4, staying in the shadows himself, using the urban camouflage techniques that had once kept him alive. As he approached Mary's building, he spotted the figure attempting to jimmy the service entrance lock. The streetlight caught a glint of metal, not just a lockpick, but something more sinister. Alfred moved silently, his heart pounding but his mind clear. Years of corporate negotiations had taught him to think strategically, while life on the streets had taught him to act decisively. He pulled out his phone, dialed Mary's number, and whispered as soon as she answered, "Stay inside, lock your door. They're here." The figure spun at the sound of his voice, and Alfred recognized Steve's partner from the previous break-in attempt. The man's face contorted with rage as he lunged forward, blade flashing in the dim light. Alfred sidestepped, using the man's momentum against him just as he had in the market. A police siren wailed in the distance. Jacob must have called them. The attacker hesitated for a split second, and that was all Alfred needed. He grabbed the man's wrist, twisting until the knife clattered to the ground. They grappled in the darkness, trading punches and wrestling for control. The sound of screeching tires announced Jacob's arrival. The attacker broke free, sprinting toward the alley, but slipped on the wet pavement. As he fell, something flew from his pocket, a small notebook. Alfred snatched it up just as police cars surrounded the building. Later that night, as police officers took statements and paramedics treated Alfred's bruised knuckles, he sat in Mary's kitchen, examining his prize. The notebook contained not just names and dates, but detailed plans for robberies across the city. It was the evidence they needed to bring down the entire operation. Mary placed a cup of tea in front of him, her hands steady despite the evening's excitement. "You could have been killed," she said softly. Alfred looked up at her, then at Jacob, who stood in the doorway. "Some things are worth the risk," he replied, thinking of how far he'd come from those cold days on the street. "Some people are worth protecting." Alfred stood in the shadows across from Mary's house, his years on the streets having taught him the art of remaining unseen. The streetlights cast long shadows across the suburban landscape, and his trained eyes caught the slight movement near Mary's kitchen window. Something wasn't right. He'd been keeping watch since dusk, following his instincts after noticing suspicious activity around the store earlier that day. His body tensed as he observed a dark figure attempting to jimmy the back door lock. Without hesitation, Alfred moved swiftly across the street, his footsteps silent from years of practice. The intruder was so focused on the lock that he didn't notice Alfred's approach until it was too late. In one fluid motion, Alfred grabbed the man's collar and pulled him away from the door. A second figure emerged from behind the bushes, wielding a crowbar. "Mary, call the police," Alfred shouted, dodging the crowbar's arc while maintaining his grip on the first intruder. The kitchen light flicked on, and through the window, he could see Mary's determined face as she reached for her phone. The fight was quick but intense. Alfred's street fighting experience proved invaluable as he maneuvered between the two attackers. A sharp blow caught his shoulder, but he managed to knock the crowbar away. The sound of breaking flower pots and grunts filled the previously quiet night. Mary appeared at the door, wielding a heavy rolling pin with surprising authority. "I've called both the police and Jacob," she announced firmly, her voice steady despite the situation. "And I'm not afraid to use this." The sight of the elderly woman brandishing her makeshift weapon might have been comical in other circumstances, but there was nothing funny about the fierce determination in her eyes. The intruders hesitated, creating an opening Alfred needed. He swept the legs out from under one while pushing the other off balance. Tires screeched in the distance, and Jacob's car came speeding around the corner, headlights illuminating the scene. The would-be burglars attempted to flee, but Alfred had positioned himself between them and their escape route. Jacob jumped out of his car, adding another barrier to their retreat. Police sirens wailed in the background as the officers arrived, finding Alfred and Jacob restraining the intruders while Mary stood guard with her rolling pin. The scene quickly transformed into a flurry of official activity. Police taking statements, crime scene photographers documenting the evidence, and detectives questioning the suspects. They're part of the same gang, one detective confirmed later, after the criminals had been cuffed and placed in patrol cars. They were planning revenge for the store incident. Had quite a detailed plan too, targeting both the store and Mrs. Johnson's house. Mary's hands trembled slightly as she made tea in her kitchen, the adrenaline finally wearing off. Alfred sat at her table, holding an ice pack to his shoulder, while Jacob paced nervously. "You could have been hurt, Mom," Jacob said, his voice thick with concern. "Both of you could have been seriously injured." "But we weren't," Mary replied calmly, setting down teacups. Thanks to Alfred's instincts and quick thinking, Alfred watched the interaction between mother and son, feeling a familiar ache in his chest. The bond between them reminded him of his own lost family, but instead of the usual crushing grief, he felt something different, a sense of belonging, of purpose. The next day, the community rallied around them. Regular customers stopped by not just to shop, but to check on Mary and offer support. Alfred found himself implementing enhanced security measures, drawing on both his corporate experience and street wisdom to protect the store and its people. Jacob called a staff meeting, announcing improved security systems and protocols. "What happened last night showed us we need to be vigilant," he said, then turned to Alfred. "And we're fortunate to have someone with Alfred's unique perspective to help us stay safe." The store became something of a fortress, but not an unwelcoming one. Alfred trained the staff in basic security awareness, teaching them to spot suspicious behavior while maintaining the friendly atmosphere that made the store special. Mary watched it all with quiet pride, seeing how Alfred had transformed from a cautious stranger into an essential part of their extended family. She continued to bring him tea during his breaks, their conversations deeper now, shaped by shared experience and mutual trust. A mysterious figure was spotted near Mary's apartment, and Alfred faced a crucial decision. The figure moved like a shadow between the parked cars, their intentions unclear, but their presence unsettling. Alfred watched from behind the store's window display, his muscles tense. The past week's events had left everyone on edge, and this new threat, if that's what it was, needed to be addressed carefully. He thought about Mary's safety, about the trust Jacob had placed in him, about everything they'd built together. The decision crystallized in his mind. He wouldn't wait for another attack. This time, they would be proactive. Alfred stepped out into the cold evening air, his footsteps deliberate. The figure noticed him and froze, then began to retreat slowly. Instead of giving chase, Alfred spoke clearly into the growing darkness. "I know who sent you," he called out, bluffing but keeping his voice steady. "And I know why you're here. But things have changed. This isn't just a store anymore, it's a family." The figure hesitated, then stepped into the dim light of a street lamp. It was a young man, barely in his 20s, looking more scared than threatening. Alfred recognized the look in his eyes, the same desperate determination he'd seen in himself years ago. "They said it would be an easy job," the young man stammered, his facade crumbling. "Just watch and report back. I didn't know. I didn't realize." Alfred approached slowly, maintaining eye contact. "What's your name?" "Tommy," the young man replied, shifting nervously. "Well, Tommy, you have two choices right now. You can either tell me everything you know about who sent you, or you can leave and never come back. But know this, if anything happens to Mary or the store, I'll know exactly who to blame." Tommy broke down, revealing details about a larger criminal organization that had been targeting small businesses in the area. The gang saw the market security improvements as a challenge to their operations. By the time the police arrived, responding to Alfred's discreet call, Tommy had provided enough information to potentially bring down the entire network. The detective who had handled their previous case looked over his notes with growing excitement. "This could be the break we've been waiting for," he said, patting Alfred on the shoulder. "You've done good work here." That night, as Alfred locked up the store, he caught his reflection in the window. The man staring back at him wasn't the same person who'd woken up on these streets months ago. He had purpose now, people to protect, a life worth living. Mary appeared beside him, 2 cups of her signature tea in hand. "You know," she said, passing him a steaming cup, "when Jacob was a little boy, he always wanted to be a superhero. I think he's finally got one working in his store." Alfred smiled, taking a sip of the perfect tea. "Not a superhero, Mary. Just someone who finally found something worth fighting for." The night settled around them, peaceful for the first time in weeks. But in the back of his mind, Alfred knew their troubles weren't over. The criminal organization wouldn't take this setback lightly, and tomorrow would bring new challenges. A mysterious figure was spotted near Mary's apartment, and Alfred faced a crucial decision. Alfred was organizing the shelves at Johnson's Market when a familiar voice caught him off guard. "Still got that sharp eye for detail, I see." Turning around, he found himself face to face with Richard Bennett, his former business partner at Tyler and Associates. The well-dressed man seemed out of place among the modest market aisles. "Richard," Alfred managed, his throat suddenly dry. "It's been 7 years, old friend." Richard stepped forward, his expensive shoes clicking on the linoleum floor. "You're not an easy man to find, but when I heard about the incident at this market, something clicked." Alfred's hands instinctively tightened around the inventory clipboard. The life he'd built at the market over the past months felt suddenly fragile against the weight of his past. "The firm's not the same without you, Al," Richard continued, pulling out a business card. "We've expanded, gone international. Your old position, well, let's just say there's room for you to come back. Better than ever." Mary, who had been arranging flowers near the entrance, approached them slowly. Her intuitive understanding of Alfred's tension was evident in her gentle presence. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "would you like some coffee? We have a small break room in the back." The three of them sat around the worn break room table. The contrast between Richard's tailored suit and the humble surroundings stark. Jacob joined them, his protective instinct for both his mother and Alfred evident in his stance. "We're talking serious numbers here, Al," Richard said, sliding a folder across the table. "Full reinstatement, partnership level, compensation package that would make up for lost time." He paused, his voice softening. "We all understood why you left after Sarah and Emily, but it's time to come home." Alfred's fingers traced the edge of the folder, memories flooding back. The corner office with its view of the city, board meetings, international calls, the life he'd once known. But with those memories came others. Sarah's laugh, Emily's first steps, the screeching tires, the rain-slicked roads. "I need time to think," Alfred said quietly. The next morning found him standing outside the imposing Tyler and Associates building, its glass facade reflecting the rising sun. Security nodded him through. Richard had arranged everything. The elevator ride to the 47th floor felt like ascending through his past. His old office had been preserved, almost like a museum piece. "We never gave up hope you'd return," Richard's assistant explained. But as Alfred stood there, surrounded by the trappings of his former life, something felt hollow. He thought of the market, of Mary's wisdom, of Jacob's growing trust, of the genuine connections he'd built. Success had a different meaning now. The decision crystallized during lunch with Richard at an upscale restaurant. "The market needs me," Alfred said finally. "Not just as an employee, they're family now." Richard studied him for a long moment. "You've changed, Al." "I have. And for the first time since losing Sarah and Emily, I feel like I'm where I need to be." Returning to the market that afternoon, Alfred found Mary arranging new produce displays. "You know," she said without looking up, "sometimes the simplest choices are the hardest to make, but the easiest to live with," Alfred replied, picking up an apple and beginning to help. The following weeks saw the market transform. Alfred's business acumen, now focused on the small family business, brought new life to the store. Jacob's trust had grown into a partnership of sorts, with Alfred helping to modernize operations while maintaining the warm, community feel. "We're thinking of expanding," Jacob announced one morning. "Nothing huge, maybe a small coffee corner, some local produce partnerships. Would you be interested in overseeing that?" Alfred smiled, remembering the portfolio Richard had offered. This was different, smaller, more personal, more real. Mary watched the exchange with knowing eyes, her presence a reminder of the family he'd found. That evening, as Alfred locked up, he caught his reflection, in the store window. The man staring back wasn't the polished executive from years ago, but he wasn't the broken man from the streets either. He was someone new, someone whole. A young homeless man appeared at the edge of the market's property, his hesitant posture reminding Alfred of his own past. Alfred watched as the young man shuffled uncertainly near the dumpsters, reminding him so much of himself just months ago. The weight of his decision to stay at Johnson's market settled comfortably in his chest, like a warm blanket on a cold night. Later that week, Richard stopped by one last time, carrying a small box. "Found these in the office archives," he said, placing it on the counter. Inside were photos from company events, including one of Alfred with Sarah and Emily at a Christmas party. "Thought you might want them." "Thank you," Alfred said, his voice steady. The photos no longer brought the crushing pain they once did. Instead, they felt like pieces of a story that had led him exactly where he needed to be. Mary helped him hang one of the photos in the break room, next to recent pictures of market staff gatherings. "Different chapters of the same life," she observed, adjusting the frame. Jacob approached them with blueprints for the market's expansion. The plans were modest but promising, a reflection of growth rooted in community rather than corporate ambition. Alfred found himself energized by the possibilities, applying his business expertise to something that mattered on a human level. "We could add a community board," Alfred suggested. "Help connect people who need work with local opportunities." The idea sparked something in Jacob's eyes, a recognition of how their little market could become something more. As they worked late into the evening, finalizing plans and discussing the future, Alfred felt a deep sense of peace. The choice between his old life and new one wasn't really a choice at all. It was a recognition of who he'd become. At closing time, Mary touched his arm gently. "You know, sometimes life's greatest blessings come disguised as its greatest losses." Her words carried the weight of someone who understood both tragedy and redemption. A young homeless man lingered outside the market's entrance, his worn backpack and uncertain stance mirroring Alfred's past like a reflection in still water.